Hey guys, this is Coach Ross, World History, and today we're going to be covering the end of the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War was an ideological struggle. However, during the 40-year standoff, it had many tense moments. The Bay of Pigs was a failed attempt by the United States and President Kennedy to overthrow the communist government in Cuba led by Fidel Castro. Later during his presidency, the world would be left on edge during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had placed missile sites in Cuba, which, as you can see from the map, is extremely close to the United States. The United States had already placed missile sites in Turkey, and for 13 days, the world waited to see who would flinch first. The crisis was averted when President Kennedy and Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev agreed to a deal. Khrushchev agreed to remove nuclear missile sites in Cuba in exchange for Kennedy promising not to invade. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove the United States' nuclear missile sites in Turkey. The United States and the Soviet Union also got involved in several proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Additionally, both sides were involved in a nuclear arms race. The 1970s experienced a period called détente, which was an easing of tensions. President Nixon became the first president to visit China, as you know, as a communist country. One of the major accomplishments of President Nixon in regards to Soviet relations was SALT, which stood for a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. SALT reduced the amount of nuclear warheads each side could possess. However, both sides still had many areas of friction, eventually ending with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Cold War in the 1980s was dominated by two men, American President Ronald Reagan and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 and was referred to as the Great Communicator. He was the first president to refer to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Unable to engage in a military conflict with the Soviets, Reagan tried a different approach, outspending the Soviets. See, the idea was that unbeknownst to many, the Soviet economy was really struggling. They were having to spend a large portion of their GDP on defense so they would not fall behind the United States. As a result, the Soviet economy could not provide many necessary goods that their people needed. Reagan's approach was to spend more money on defense, which would force the Soviet Union to do the same, putting more and more strain on their already fragile economy. One of the famous defense programs started under President Reagan was the Strategic Defense Initiative Program, more commonly known as the Star Wars program. This defense program was designed to develop technology to shoot nuclear warheads out of the atmosphere from space using lasers. And as you can probably guess, this was expensive. The Star Wars program never successfully developed this technology, and we still have not been able to successfully do this even today. But along with many other defense initiatives approved by Reagan, the Soviet economy could not compete. You see, the inefficiencies of a command economy over time had taken their toll on the Soviets. I mean, you guys remember the lesson on economic systems. What car would you be driving right now when you get your driver's license? That's right, a Yugo. Mikhail Gorbachev became president of the Soviet Union and promised reform through two policies called Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost means openness in Russian, and the policy permitted much more civil liberties in the Soviet Union. Glasnost also permitted criticism of the government and allowed for greater freedom of the press. It also reduced the power of the Communist Party by allowing multi-candidate elections. Crazy, right? Gorbachev's second policy was Perestroika, which means restructuring in Russian. Perestroika introduced several market reforms to the Soviet Union aimed at improving the lives of consumers, because you can't go to work driving a Yugo. All in all, Gorbachev's policies set up the groundwork for a massive shift from communism to capitalism and democracy. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was extremely weakened, and when the Soviet Union did nothing to stop the revolutionary movements in Eastern Europe, the writing was on the wall. See what I did there? I had a pun. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and the official reasoning of the building the wall by the Soviet Union was to keep the Western fascists out of East Germany. In reality, the wall served as a physical barrier to keep its own citizens from defecting to West Germany. The wall served as one of the most noticeable and powerful symbols of the Cold War. On December 25th, Christmas Day, 1991, many of the Soviet satellite states had declared independence from the Soviet Union, and that day Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the Soviet Union officially dissolved and the Cold War was over. Thank you guys for listening. Be sure that you guys stay updated by following me on Twitter at Ross History. Also, be sure to check out my website for individual lessons. Thank you guys for listening.